The Defense Department recently announced another aid package to Ukraine. It will send $625 million in security assistance. Bryan Clark is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Bryan, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Mimi. Great to see you.
So what weapons are included in this latest round of assistance?
So we're going to see a continued shipment of the kinds of weapons the U.S. has been sending thus far. So more rockets for HIMARS, some additional HIMARS that are actually going to be coming out of new construction stock, so not necessarily things out of the existing stock. So those HIMARS are going to be built and then sent to Ukraine, which means there will be some delay. Some additional unmanned aerial vehicles, so more of the Switchblade, some more of the Phoenix Ghost kind of drones that have been used thus far to great effect by the Ukrainians. And then additional ammunition to support both the artillery that they have and also the ground weapons that they have, the crew-served as well as small arms. You
mentioned HIMARS, and that's really been credited with the success of this counteroffensive.
Right.
Explain that weapon and why it's been so effective.
Yeah, so HIMARS is a missile launcher that can support anything from a relatively small rocket, which is mostly what we've been providing to them, up to the very large ATACMS missile, which can go a couple hundred miles. So the U.S. has been providing the rockets to Ukraine, which can reach out to 40 to 50 miles away, which can be very effective at being able to hit the rear part of the Russian lines, and it forces the Russians to not be able to get their logistics up to the front, and it also undermines their ability to do command and control. So their forces up at the front lines are now uncoordinated, unable to get guidance from their commanders back aft.
Well, besides those really fancy weapons that the U.S. has been giving them, why has Ukraine's counteroffensive been so successful? Or is it all about those weapons?
Well, it's partly because those weapons, because they've been able to attack command and control nodes that the Russians have been using, logistics depots the Russians have been using, so their forces at the front have been less well supplied, less coordinated. And part of it also is the fact that the Russians have been redeploying troops. So the Russian lines were never all that thick to begin with, so they are relatively thinly distributed across the front lines. They redeployed a lot of troops out of Kharkiv in the north, which led to Ukraine gains along the north. They've also been redeploying troops even within Kherson, which is in the south, where most of the fighting is now happening, because they're trying to stiffen up those lines and make them thicker so that they can be better defended against the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So it's partly the result of Ukraine getting better weapons. It's also partly because the Russians are being more strategic with regard to how they deploy their troops, because, as we've heard, they've got shortages of manpower, and they're trying to do the best they can with that smaller force.
I do want to ask you about Russian troops, but before we do that, Ukraine has been asking for American long-range missiles. The U.S. said no.
Yes, so Ukraine's been asking both for longer-range missiles like ATACMS, as well as longer-range unmanned vehicles like the MQ-1 Gray Eagle, which is an Army unmanned vehicle that the U.S. has and had talked about providing to Ukraine. Both of those weapons would allow them to attack all the way to the Russian border and maybe even into Russia. So obviously,
which is the big concern.
That's a concern for the U.S. But from the Ukrainian perspective, it would allow them to attack some of these deeper logistics nodes that are supporting the Russian effort, and maybe attack some of the key infrastructure that Russia's depending on to support their troops in the field, especially air bases that are supporting airstrikes that are going against Ukrainian troops and civilian targets today.
And so from the American perspective, it's that fear of escalation.
Correct.
If they were to strike right into Russia.
Right, and to some degree, both sides are right, because to some degree, the Ukrainians will have to escalate and attack some of these more strategic targets in order to be successful, because at this point, they've sort of collapsed the Russian forces down to a core that's going to be relatively well defended. To get past that, they're going to have to make these larger attacks deeper into Russian-held territory or even into Russia.
So do you recommend that?
I would recommend that, yes. I think we have, if Ukraine's going to actually win or at least regain their territory, they're going to have to attack Russian troops back closer to the Russian border. So that's really the conundrum that we're in. And it seems like the United States might be thinking that there could be some negotiated settlement that could be reached where Russia gains some of this territory and keeps it, and Ukraine's not willing to accept that.
I want to ask you about what's widely seen as sabotage of the undersea gas pipelines between Russia and Germany. Explain the significance of that pipeline and who would want to attack it.
Well, the pipeline is the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines that go between Russia and then Europe, both Germany and also into Sweden and Finland. Those pipelines go in the Baltic Sea, so they're at about 300 feet underwater. They're hardened, and protected, so it's the kind of thing that's going to be very difficult for an accident to have damaged. And the explosions were all relatively short together, so it implied sabotage. But that basically cuts off a lot of the natural gas pipeline or flow between Russia and Europe. And it sort of gives Russia an excuse to be able to say, I can't send you any more gas because the pipeline's broken, which might be a rationale for why Russia would have done it. So it's a way for them to be able to argue they can't provide gas to Europe during the winter, but while not making it seem like it's their fault.
And we talked about the shortage in Russian troops. There has been a draft called by Putin. What impact are we likely to see on the battlefield?
Well, what's happening right now is the 300,000 that Putin called up were reservists who have some military experience, maybe not combat experience. So it's people who are not untrained, but they're probably out of training for a long period of time. They're relatively green troops. So whatever number of those make it to the front line are not going to be your front line hardened combat troops. They're going to be there basically to fill in the gaps in that smaller defensive perimeter that Russia has set up down in Kherson to the south. So you'll see some impact in that it'll be a little bit stronger, but it's not going to allow Russia to be able to regain the offensive. It's more or less to shore up their defenses as we head into winter.
All right. Well, Bryan, appreciate you coming in.
My pleasure, Mimi. Great to see you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.